In the tense and desperate spring of 1944, deep within the nerve center of the Third Reich in Berlin, a scene unfolded that defied the conventional logic of warfare. High-ranking German intelligence officers gathered around a heavy conference table, the surface of which was completely obscured by a chaotic collage of reconnaissance photographs, intercepted radio communications, and urgent field reports. In a war spanning continents, involving millions of men and thousands of machines, one might expect the focus of the German High Command to be on vast army groups, logistical supply lines, or the movement of entire naval fleets. Yet, these officers were not tracking the broad strokes of the Allied war machine. Instead, their collective anxiety and vast intelligence resources were focused with laser-like intensity on a single individual. They were tracking one man. His name was George S. Patton. To the German General Staff, he was not merely an enemy commander, he was an obsession. For months leading up to the inevitable invasion of Europe, the German High Command had dedicated more intelligence assets to locating and tracking Patton than they had for any other Allied leader. This fixation was unique. They did not scrutinize Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander who orchestrated the entire war effort. With such paranoia, they did not fixate on Bernard Montgomery, the British hero who had famously dueled with Erwin Rommel across the sands of North Africa. Those generals were respected, certainly, but they did not induce fear. Patton was different. He consumed German intelligence attention like a black hole. Even Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the revered senior German commander in Western Europe, a man who had seen everything in war and fought the very best the Allies had to offer, personally monitored Patton's movements. To Rundstedt, any scrap of information regarding Patton's location was considered intelligence of the highest priority. Rundstedt knew that where Patton went, the fire would follow. He was terrified of the American general. The roots of this profound fear were planted in November 1942. During Operation Torch, the massive Allied invasion of North Africa, this operation marked the first time German forces faced the American army in a major ground offensive. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, tasked with the daunting objective of landing 35,000 American troops on the hostile coast of Morocco. The German commanders, meticulous students of warfare, watched this operation with clinical detachment, looking for the telltale signs of their new enemy's character. They analyzed the Americans for patterns, for weaknesses, for predictable tendencies they could exploit in future battles. But what they observed in Patton's sector troubled them immediately. The reports coming back from the front lines described a commander who moved with a speed that theoretical doctrine suggested was impossible. The prevailing German view of the American military was that it was a lumbering giant, methodical, cautious, and heavily reliant on overwhelming artillery and air superiority before risking an infantry advance. Patton shattered this stereotype instantly. In a mere 3 days, he had maneuvered his forces to capture the strategic city of Casablanca and forced the surrender of the French forces there. He covered ground and achieved objectives at a velocity that caught the German observers completely off guard. This was not the cautious advance of a democracy's army, this was a blitzkrieg. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding the German forces in the Mediterranean theater, was so alarmed by this performance that he demanded a comprehensive intelligence dossier on this new adversary. He wanted to know who Patton was, how he thought, and what made him tick. The intelligence reports that returned to Kesselring's desk were unsettling. They revealed that George Patton was not a typical American officer. He was a scholar of war who had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of conflict. More disturbingly for the Germans, Patton had studied them. He had read the works of German military theorists in the original German language. He had walked the battlefields of Europe, internalizing the geography and the lessons of history. He understood the German philosophy of war, the emphasis on speed, aggression, and encirclement, perhaps better than many German officers did. He was an American fighting with a German soul. The threat Patton posed transitioned from theoretical to terrifyingly real following the disaster at Kasserine Pass in early 1943. At Kasserine, veteran German forces under Rommel had smashed into inexperienced American troops, causing a humiliating rout. The American lines broke, and soldiers fled in panic. The German High Command watched closely, expecting the American morale to crumble permanently. They waited to see if the U.S. Army would retreat into a shell of caution. Instead, the Americans sent in George Patton. In March 1943, he took command of the broken, demoralized Second Corps, The transformation that followed was nothing short of miraculous, a feat of leadership that stunned German intelligence. In just 2 weeks, Patton completely resurrected the fighting spirit of the Second Corps. He imposed strict discipline, restored pride, and turned a defeated mob into a lethal fighting force. The very soldiers who had fled at Kasserine were suddenly attacking with savage effectiveness. German reconnaissance scouts operating along the front lines reported a palpable change in the atmosphere. American patrols were no longer tentative, they were probing the German defenses with a new, aggressive ferocity. The legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, noted this shift in his private diary. He wrote that the American forces had suddenly become far more dangerous. He realized that this rapid evolution in combat effectiveness could not be explained by new tanks or more ammunition. It was the result of a singular will, the arrival of a new commander who demanded victory at any cost. If North Africa was the introduction, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the masterclass that solidified Patton's reputation as the most dangerous man in the Allied camp. The Allied strategic plan for Sicily was conservative. British General Montgomery and his 8th Army were designated to lead the main attack up the eastern coast, while Patton's 7th Army was relegated to a supporting role, protecting Montgomery's flank. Patton, however, refused to be a mere bodyguard. In an act of defiance and aggressive genius, he unleashed his army across the rugged western half of the island. He drove his men relentlessly, covering terrain that was thought to be impassable for heavy armor, and he did it with a speed that left both his allies and his enemies gaping in disbelief. As the campaign neared its climax, the German forces attempted a strategic withdrawal across the Strait of Messina to escape to the Italian mainland. They expected to have time to conduct an orderly evacuation. Instead, they found themselves in a desperate footrace against Patton's vanguard. Patton pushed his troops so hard that the German escape route was constantly under threat of being severed. Units that thought they had days to retreat found American tanks bearing down on them in hours. The evacuation turned into a chaotic scramble as German commanders struggled to save their men from the relentless pressure. In the end, Patton reached the city of Messina hours before Montgomery, having fought his way across 200 miles of hostile territory in just 39 days. The German after-action reports from Sicily were filled with a mixture of professional respect and genuine alarm. One German officer, writing a detailed analysis of the campaign, noted that Patton did not fight like an American infantry general. He fought like a panzer commander. He took risks that American doctrine strictly forbade. He exploited momentary weaknesses in the German lines before the defenders could even react. He did not wait for perfect logistics, he attacked. To the Germans, he was a mirror image of their own best qualities, but fighting for the other side. However, the narrative of Patton took a strange turn in August 1943. In a moment of intense strain, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in field hospitals, accusing them of cowardice. The political fallout in the United States was immense. Eisenhower reprimanded him, and the press vilified him. But deep in the intelligence headquarters of Berlin, the Germans interpreted this event differently. They could not conceive that the United States would discard its most brilliant battlefield commander over such a trivial incident. To the German mind, which valued military effectiveness above all else, the idea was fastidious and absurd. They concluded that the slapping incident and Patton's subsequent disappearance from the front lines were part of a grand deception. By early 1944, Patton was in England, commanding the 1st United States Army Group. In reality, this army was a phantom, a fiction created by Allied intelligence involving inflatable rubber tanks, plywood airplanes, and fake radio traffic. But because the Germans believed so fervently in Patton's importance, the deception worked perfectly. German intelligence was convinced that wherever Patton was, the main Allied invasion force was also gathering. They reasoned that the Allies would never waste their best general on a diversion. Therefore, Patton must be leading the decisive blow. This belief paralyzed the German military response. For weeks after the actual D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, powerful German panzer divisions sat idle in the Pas-de-Calais region, hundreds of miles away from the fighting. They were waiting for Patton. They were waiting for the real invasion that never came. The ghost of Patton pinned down more German divisions than entire real armies could have, simply because the Germans feared him too much to move. When Patton finally was unleashed upon the continent in August 1944, taking command of the Third Army, He validated every nightmare the Germans had harbored. The resulting campaign was a blitzkrieg in reverse. In the first 2 weeks of August, Patton's forces devoured French territory, liberating more ground than the combined Allied forces had managed in the previous 2 months of slog in the hedgerows. The German command structure in western France began to disintegrate. Patton's tanks seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing in rear areas, severing supply lines, and overrunning headquarters before the German staff officers could even finish their morning coffee. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge sent desperate, frantic messages to Berlin, reporting that Patton's columns were uncatchable and unpredictable. The culmination of this aggressive warfare was the closing of the Falaise Gap. Patton recognized a golden opportunity to encircle the retreating German 7th Army. He drove his forces north with blistering speed to link up with Canadian and Polish troops pushing south. The result was a slaughter. Tens of thousands of German troops were trapped in a pocket of destruction that survivors later described as hell on earth, worse. Some said, than the horrors of Stalingrad. The difference was that at Stalingrad, the Germans had time to dig in and starve slowly. With Patton, there was no time, there was only the sudden, violent shock of encirclement and annihilation. Yet, perhaps the greatest testament to Patton's legendary status came during the Battle of the Bulge in the freezing winter of 1944. In a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies completely off guard and surrounding the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. At an emergency meeting in Verdun, Supreme Commander Eisenhower asked his generals how long it would take to launch a counterattack to relieve the besieged troops. The other generals, calculating the immense logistical difficulties of fighting in a blizzard, estimated it would take weeks to reorient their forces. Patton, however, looked Eisenhower in the eye and said, 48 hours. The room was stunned. The other commanders thought Patton was boasting, that he was making a promise he couldn't keep. Turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of a winter storm was a logistical impossibility. But Patton was not bluffing. He had foreseen the German attack. His intelligence officer, Oskar Koch, had predicted the offensive, and Patton had quietly prepared contingency plans. With a single phone call, he set a miracle in motion. In one of the greatest logistical feats in military history, Patton swung the Third Army north. Over 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles disengaged from one battle, marched through ice and snow, and struck the flank of the German offensive. Within the promised 48 hours, Patton's tanks were smashing into the German lines. On December 26, he broke the siege of Bastogne, halting the German advance and effectively ending Hitler's last gamble in the West. When the war finally ended and the smoke cleared over a ruined Europe, Allied interrogators sat down with captured German generals to debrief them. Men like Field Marshal von Rundstedt and General Fritz Bayerlein were asked to evaluate their opponents. They were asked whom they respected and whom they feared. Their answers were remarkably consistent. They respected Montgomery for his methodical planning. They respected Bradley for his steadiness. But the man they feared, the man who kept them awake at night, was George Patton. They feared him because he was the embodiment of the chaos of war. They feared him because he was unpredictable. While other Allied generals followed a recognizable sheet of music, playing by the rules of supply and doctrine, Patton improvised. He attacked when the textbooks said to defend. He advanced when logistics dictated a halt. He took risks that his superiors considered reckless but which his enemies found terrifying. To the German mind, Patton was the only Allied commander who truly understood the art of mobile warfare. As von Rundstedt concluded, Patton was the supreme master. The German generals, the men who had invented the blitzkrieg and conquered Europe with it, finally learned what it felt like to be on the receiving end. They learned what it felt like to face a commander who fought exactly like they did, only better.